Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Daniel Kinzler. I'm working for the Wikimedia Foundation on the core platform team. I've been the chair of the technical committee for a number of years now. And in that capacity, I helped to create the new stable interface policy for MediaWiki. The new policy replaces the old deprecation policy. In particular, it explicitly defines what the stable interface is, or the interface that we want to keep stable. The deprecation process itself doesn't really change. The new policy will apply to all releases starting with 1.35, which means that the first changes that were made according to the new policy will be part of 1.36. So there will be some time to adopt to the new policy. So the basic idea here is to make life easier by making things harder. I'll try to explain in a minute what I mean by that. The background for all that is the idea of platform evolution. The Wikimedia Foundation has committed to making MediaWiki as a platform easier to understand, easier to use, easier to extend, easier to maintain and test. And that means we have to change quite a bit of old code, and we have to change some of the structures. But public things are hard to change, right? When you change public interfaces, things break, or you have to go through time-consuming deprecation policies, deprecation processes, sorry. So what is a stable interface? Basically, a stable interface, or the stable interface policy, tells you what you can safely rely on, and it tells us, who work on MediaWiki Core, what we can safely change without breaking extensions. That's the basic idea. So it's a kind of contract. With the old policy, the old deprecation process, there were a few gray areas. These are actually gray areas that pop up quite a bit, also with other libraries and so on. What's actually public, right? Are protected methods public? I mean, when you extend a class, you have access to them, right? So maybe they are, maybe not. For public methods, you can call them, sure. How about overriding them? When we add a new optional parameter, that's fine for calling them. It's not necessarily fine when you have overridden that method. Constructor signatures. Are constructor signatures part of the stable public interface? Should they be? And as always, the answer is it depends. And we tried to clarify this with the new policy. So the making life easier part is extension authors, extension developers should see less surprises because things are more explicit now. And eventually over time should have a much better platform to work with. I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by a better platform. So if you have worked with MediaWiki as an extension developer or working on core, you have probably noticed that MediaWiki has grown over the last 15-ish years to be pretty big and tangled. Tangled not just in terms of static dependencies, which classes depend on which other classes, but also tangled in terms of runtime behavior. You change something that seems innocent and something else falls over at the other end of the code base, which you would have never expected to be affected. And yeah, even the static dependencies, when you run a static dependency analysis, you will find that more than half of the code is basically one big tangle of everything depending on everything. So that, of course, needs fixing. The different parts of the code base need to be decoupled. which means we have to split classes. We are working hard to introduce dependency injection in, well, basically across the code base. We are working to improve the hook system and clarify what information becomes available to hooks and what hook handlers can do. The hope is that we will have much clearer flows of data and control, more type safety, especially in the context of hooks, and just make it easier to write code that is testable and reusable by sticking to a few new design principles. So that's the idea of, or that's one way we are trying to improve the code base. So what's the making things harder part is talking about which things that used to be assumed safe or stable in the future will no longer be safe and stable, at least not per default, at least not unless documented to be so. One thing that extensions will no longer be able to do safely is instantiate arbitrary objects defined by core. Of course, it will still be necessary to instantiate some objects. I will talk about that in a bit. But in general, if the class is not documented as such, it is not safe to instantiate instances directly. The reason for that is that we need the freedom to change constructor signatures, and especially in the context of introducing dependency injection. Similarly, it will only be safe to override methods that are designed for overriding. So we have the freedom to safely introduce additional parameters. Similarly, extending classes will only be safe if it is explicitly documented to be safe. So we can do things like break up things. So we add in new abstract methods, for instance, which would, of course, break extensions that extended the class before. And one very big one is global variables. We really want to get rid of all usages of global state. And global variables, of course, are the prime example of that. So direct access to global variables will be considered to be unsafe per default, starting with the MediaWiki 1135. So examples of things that should no longer happen in an extension is something like creating a new parser object directly by using the new operator. You should use a parser factory instead. Extending classes that are not designed to be extended, like the title class. Implement interfaces that are not documented to be safe to be implemented directly. That one is perhaps a bit counterintuitive, right? Abstract interfaces are the textbook example of an extension point. It seems like this would be the obvious way for an extension to provide its own implementation of some functionality. And in some cases, that is certainly true and will remain true. But we have found that having extensions implement interfaces directly is puts very hard constraints of how we can change the code base, right? We can't add a method, we can change any signature in the interface. We could introduce a new interface, but then all the code that uses objects would have to check whether that object implements just the old interface or also the new interface. Things become very messy. So we have found that the better approach is to provide a base class that can be extended by extensions. So we can put backwards compatibility code there. Yes, and of course, as I mentioned, something like directly accessing WG user should no longer happen. So while all of this is no longer supported by defaults, if you still do it, no black helicopters will show up, right? So you of course still can do these things, but we will no longer guarantee that we won't break these without deprecation notices for an entire release. If you are fine, or if you're fine as an extension author to just follow along with the development of core, have automated testing set up to detect breakages and fix these things, then that is totally fine as well. So yeah, in general, not all is lost, of course. Stability of calls does not change. If something is declared public and you have an instance, you can just call as before. That I suppose that's obvious, but I just wanted to mention it in case anyone got worried. And since things like directly instantiating objects and extending classes, of course, is still useful and necessary, we have defined a number of stability annotations that will be used to declare classes and methods to be stable in a certain way. And while we were working on the policy, it became clear that there's actually several ways or several aspects of classes and methods that can be stable or unstable. One very prominent type of stability would be stable for instantiation, or in a word, to be newable. That would be the case for simple value objects, anything that doesn't need to know about its environment, that is just a collection of values. Oh, sorry. And other kinds of stability are stable for subclassing and implementing for base classes and interfaces, respectively, and being stable for overriding. So a protected or public method may be declared stable for overriding if subclasses can provide their own implementation. That means that even if a class is declared to be stable for subclassing, and extensions can create their own subclass, not all methods in that class would be fine for overriding. Because PHP is pretty sensitive to changes in the signature of the base implementation of a method. And we want to make sure that we don't inadvertently break things when a method was overwritten that was not designed as an extension point. So, as I said before, the new policy will start to be applicable with the release of MediaWiki 1.35. But since we can only make changes according to the new policy, once that release has been branched, you will only see such changes by the release of 1.36, which I would expect sometime around the end of the year. So if you are an extension author and you might be affected by these policy changes, you have, well, you have a half year or more to adapt to the new policy, or tell us about the problems you run into when trying to adapt to it. This is, I think, the most important part of the of this presentation. It is very important to us that we don't just lock people out and don't just make things impossible. If there doesn't seem to be an alternative way to achieve what you are trying to do under the new policy, let us know so we can create such a way. And so in many cases, that might just be adding a stability annotation and saying, okay, we commit to keeping this stable. for the purpose of whatever it may be, subclassing, for instance. Or it may mean that we introduce a factory service or some other way to get to the functionality that you want to get to. So this is all I have prepared. I hope I was reasonably clear, but I also hope that you have a lot of questions. I have reserved half the time that was allotted to me for discussion, because I expect that the new policy may sound a bit scary to people who work a lot on extensions. So I wanted to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about these things. So for now, thanks for listening. And are there any questions?
Thank you, Daniel. There are indeed questions, at least a couple in Zoom and one at least on YouTube. Oh my goodness, they're piling up. So we'll start with Ike.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and try to find the participants list so I'm no longer confused.
Sure thing. Ike, go ahead.
All right. First of all, thank you very much, Daniel. And I very much agree with the title. All these things make our life more difficult, but I'd much prefer it this way, to be able to make sure our code is going to be more stable, and also that we don't get any more surprises in code review that, you know, we're doing something wrong. You know, as extension authors, I think we want to just get it to work, and we're happy to follow whatever policy will get it to work and make it as stable as possible for the future. So I think it's great. My question is, you mentioned that it would be basically ready by 1.36. Does that mean that like every single class and method has been reviewed, and if it's ready and available for things like inheritance and all the other tags, like if it could be tagged, that it was tagged as stable, or just that that's when I guess part of it will be ready?
So what the plan is that by 1.35 we have all the essential things tagged. This has not happened yet. We are basically lining up the work to do that. It is not that, so it does not really require us to review every single method. We only have to look at the things that are actually touched by extensions. But yeah, the idea is indeed to have the basic set ready by the release of 1.35, which you probably have heard has been pushed back, right? It's not, we are not branching this month. Otherwise, it would not be realistic. But I expect this work to take, you know, probably until the end of the month, and then we will have everything tagged that we want to mark as stable for now.
Thank you.
All right, next question from Wolfgang.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for your talk. I think this is a good move to make sure that things get more stable. I'm one of the organizations that has a lot of problems with unstable stuff. I'm stuck with MediaWiki 127.3 for about 30 of my farm wikis. I moved about 10 to a newer wiki. I think it's a 133 something. And while I'm doing that for over a year, everything is moving on. And when I'm finished with moving my 127, I'll be in an outdated wiki again. And I hate that situation, especially since I'm committing to quite a few extensions and trying to solve problems and doing things. And it's like a catch-22. There is no way out of this. And I think my main question is how not only the stability issue is going to be solved, but how the different speed of people doing extensions who do that in their spare time with just a few hours of work they can spend every month or year against a foundation which may have dozens and hundreds of developers who keep changing small things and not really knowing what the outcome will be for all those extensions that break that. And it might be a small change in MediaWiki and only a small benefit, and it will harm like a dozen extensions who fail to work at all. And I'd like to know how some kind of speed adjustment or impact analysis could be implemented to avoid such situations. What do you think how this could be done?
I find it interesting that your perception is that development of MediaWiki on the foundation side is faster than extension development. My impression is exactly the opposite, because the extensions are relatively small and self-contained. Making changes to them is a lot quicker than making changes to MediaWiki. Of course, that's talking about big and fundamental changes. If you just count the number of commits, of course, many more changes are made to MediaWiki core. The only answer I have is that making the interfaces between MediaWiki core and the extensions more narrow and well-defined should help with making it more predictable which changes will break things, and making it so that most changes don't break anything. That's the ultimate goal. Unfortunately, things have to get worse before they can get better, right? If we, for instance, we have, I think, something like 400 hooks, and we will probably have to change all of them to make them comply to the new ideas of actually only exposing narrow interfaces or making everything serializable and these things, which of course means we have to change all the 400 hooks. And yeah, that's the bit where it gets worse before it gets better. And yeah, unfortunately, I don't know a way around that. If you can think of one, I would be very happy to hear it.
Yeah, one thing would be actually doing the impact analysis first, even by standard means of sending out an email to all the developers and say, if I do this, would that harm you? And then you'd say, please don't do this, I'm relying on that. And there would be some discussion on it. Currently, I don't think such a discussion is happening.
Yeah, it's, well, for any changes that are predicted from the outset to be cross-cutting or have effects on many people and extensions, we have the RFC process, which is intended to provide this kind of feedback channel, and which we are working to extend and make more inclusive. There's some internal restructuring happening right now. It will probably be a couple of months before anything will be forthcoming there. But yeah, we are working on making this process more transparent and more available to people outside the foundation. On the other hand, because it is so unpredictable which changes actually may have an impact, it's kind of impossible to always do this, right? We can't do this for every patch. That would be dozens a day. That wouldn't work. So the best we can do is try and anticipate what high impact changes are and try to have a conversation about them first.
All right, Brian is next.
Yeah, I have one question from YouTube and one from Zoom chat, but from YouTube, what recommended alternative method should be used to replace global state?
The short answer is dependency injection. So we have had a service container instance in MediaWiki core for a couple of years now, which we have started to use more and more. The idea is essentially that any class would ask in the constructor for all the things that it needs, and the service container or the wiring code around it would make sure it gets these things. And anything that is not available at bootstrap time would have to be passed as a parameter to a method call. And this does mean that the code has to be structured differently. You can't just change code to dependency injection without changing the structure of the code, which is exactly why we are working on restructuring MediaWiki core code base as well.
Okay, thank you. And then from Zoom, it's probably more of a comment, but from Adam Shorlin, from his experience of making some of these changes to core, having your extensions on Garrett will help, and small things would likely have patches submitted as things change in core.
That is definitely true. And there is actually a wrinkle there that I didn't talk about. According to the new policy, any code that is unused by repositories known to us can be changed without notice. So stability guarantees are given to code that is public. They're not given to code that is private. That was that may sound like a tough decision. It basically means that we can be more pragmatic about when we actually do deprecation processes. We have been held back by lengthy processes which we felt had no benefit for anyone because the code was unused anyway, and we didn't want to be in that situation again. And the other argument was, of course, that as an open source project, we want to encourage people who write extensions to contribute back to the community.
And I'll add to that that we routinely use code search, which is a tool on Wikimedia Labs, to search for code and extensions and core so that we can see what code will be affected. And code search checks code on Garrett, but also there's a list of external repos that it checks that are things like hosted on GitHub. And so it will, the code doesn't strictly have to be on Garrett, but it does have to be known to code search. And with that, I'll go on to Yaron, has a question.
Hi, Daniel. Yeah, first I want to agree that hosting your code on Garrett definitely is a great idea because a lot of people are making improvements and so forth, I guess in some cases based on these guidelines. My question, it might be a silly question, but how new, what actually is new in these guidelines? I mean, the global variables like WG user and all those have been deprecated for a while, or most of them, and you know, I haven't. You haven't been supposed to call new title or new parser or things like that in a while either. Is it just formalizing things that have already been known for a while, or are there actually new elements to this?
It is basically it is a logical consequence of a trend that has been going on for a while. But something like you were not supposed to directly instantiate title or user for a while. That is true. Parser also, it used to be okay, but it has been deprecated for a couple of releases now. But for most things, it's not explicit anywhere in the code base, right? Constructor is public, why not call it? Right. And we now officially, and we actually go through quite some pain to make sure that we stay backwards compatible when introducing new parameters. And with the new policy, this will just remove the need for us to go through that pain and be able to just freely change things when they need to change.
Yeah.
So we have been moving in that direction with bits and pieces, and this is basically just consolidating all that.
Great, thank you.
All right, we're going to take one last question from Charlie.
All right. Okay. I'm really looking forward to all these changes because I'm really for it. The only thing I wanted to mention is that documentation. It would really be nice if everything was documented extensively instead of. I find myself inside the documentation like what was it's the PHP doc export that you have. And sometimes there's just nothing there. You just need to experiment to find out what you need and what you get out of there. And that's if you're not like really into MediaWiki and you know every changes that are made and you keep track of that. I just don't have the time. So it would be really, really nice if if you make those changes, you really document them. Okay, what is the input, what is needed for that, and what comes out of it. So when you look at it as a developer, you don't have to go through various steps to find out what exactly these new functions are going to do, or what the changes are. You know, those kind of things. That would really help in developing the extensions.
Yeah, I value documentation a lot, and I think with new code we have gotten pretty good at class level and method level documentation. One thing that we still need to get a lot better at, besides of course implementing old code, documenting old code, implemented it already is to describe higher level concepts, right? Describe architectural structures, describe data flows, describe conceptual things. And sometimes documentation like that exists. Typically it's written on the wiki and then it's not touched for 8 years and becomes outdated. And yeah, integrating this better and having a better process for making sure this kind of documentation is up to date and actually exists for all subsystems and data flows, that is something that we really need to get better at. That's kind of orthogonal to stable interface policy, but you're of course right that a process that requires us to review large parts of our interface is a good time to also identify bits that need documentation. Yeah, thanks for that.
No problem. Looking forward to that, and perhaps have it in one spot. So if you're a developer and you need documentation, you know where to find it. Because looking on a MediaWiki website is well, that's not, you always have to go to the export of the PHP doc export basically, because that's true and that's what's running right now. So yeah, in one spot would be really nice. Even if it's there, it would be fine, because indeed some of your interfaces and functions are described really well, and the other ones, they don't have anything. So yeah. But looking forward to it. But I thought I'd just mention it. So, but it's on your mind. So, looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you.